Welcome back to Human Biological Sciences 2. I'm Jenny Yules. Today we start a three-part component of the cardiovascular system which will concentrate on the heart. We'll be looking at where the heart is located, how it's orientated when compared to surrounding tissues like the ribs, for instance. We'll look at surface projections of the heart, the very important layers of the heart, especially the myocardium, which is the thick muscular wall that participates in blood or pumping of the blood around the body. We'll look at the valves inside the heart, and we'll look at some of the histological features of cardiac muscle as well as its intrinsic conduction system. So let's start with the anatomy or structure of the heart. So the cardiovascular system consists of the blood, which we've already covered, the heart, and the blood vessels. They supply blood to all regions of the body, and they also maintain homeostasis. The heart is a very, very important pump. It's a very efficient pump, and it circulates the blood through an estimated 97,000 kilometres of blood vessels. It pumps around about 100,000 times a day if it was pumping at about 70 beats per minute. That means it would pump about 35 million times in a year. And if you lived to the age of 80, your heart would pump approximately 2.8 billion times in your lifetime. The heart is located between the lungs. It occupies quite a large proportion of the left lung space, and that is why the left lung only has 2 lobes, whereas the right lung has 3 lobes. But even though we may think that the heart lies predominantly to the left side, it actually lies only just left of the midline. It lies in an area called the mediastinum, and this area contains, or is an area from the sternum anteriorly through to the vertebral column posteriorly. And because the heart lies between 2 rigid structures, the vertebral column and the sternum, external heart compression is able to be done to help to move blood through the body if the heart stops during cardiac arrest. This is an image of the lungs and the heart. We're looking down on the heart, and you can see two of the atrioventricular valves and one of the semilunar valves. You can also see the relationship of the heart to the lungs, and this image gives you a very good indication as to where the heart lies in relationship to the lungs. Actually, we're looking up. We're looking from underneath and looking up in this image. So the heart just moves slightly into the left side of the body. It's not completely on that left side like we may have been led to believe. So the orientation of the heart has an apex and a base. The apex is directed anteriorly and inferiorly and to the left of the thoracic chest or the chest cavity. The base is directed posteriorly and superiorly and slightly to the right. So the heart actually lies on an oblique angle. The anterior surface of the heart is deep to the sternum and the ribs. The inferior surface rests on the diaphragm. The right border faces the right lung, and the left border faces the left lung. The apex of the heart lies around about the fifth intercostal space on the midclavicular line, and the base of the heart sits at around about the second intercostal space just right of the sternum. So in this diagram we can see the relationship of the heart to the lungs, where it sits. You can see that it sits, its inferior surface sits on the diaphragm. It has some great vessels which we will talk about shortly. So it's almost central within the mediastinum. So the surface projections of the heart: the superior right point at the superior border of the third right costal cartilage. The superior left point is at the inferior border of the second left intercostal cartilage, 3 centimetres to the left of the midline. The inferior left point, or the left side, the inferior left, points at the fifth intercostal space, about 9 centimetres from the midline, and the inferior right point is at the superior border of the sixth right costal cartilage, about 3 centimetres from the midline. Here's another diagram that shows you where the heart sits in relation to the ribs. So as you can see on the diagram on the left, the apex of the heart, or the inferior left point, sits around about the fifth intercostal space, so that's the fifth space between the ribs, approximately on the midclavicular line. And you can find the midclavicular line by finding your clavicle and dividing it in half and running a line inferiorly down to the fifth intercostal space. The superior right point of the heart lies just on the third costal, or just behind the third costal cartilage. Now we look at the coverings, or the layers of the heart. The heart's enclosed and also held in place by a structure called the pericardium. Now the pericardium consists of a couple of layers. There's the outer layer, which is called the fibrous pericardium. It's quite tough. It's made of fibrous tissue and it helps to anchor the heart in place. The inner layer consists of a serous pericardium known as the epicardium. And the serous pericardium is one of two parts of the serous membrane. Of course, the viscerous or visceral pericardium is firmly adhered to the heart itself. So if we have a look at this diagram, you can see on the left, the top left picture, this is a cross-section of the heart. You can see the thickness of the myocardium, which is the muscle layer, and the outer pericardium. Now if we look a little bit closer at that in the image on the right, top right image, you can see the muscle, which is the dense pink area. Then we have the pericardium. Now there is the visceral pericardium that hugs the heart itself, so it's attached to the heart. There is then a space between the visceral and the parietal pericardium. And then, of course, the outer layer is the fibrous pericardium. That's the thicker portion. The lining of the heart is called the endocardium. This is made up of thin, flat, squamous cells called endothelial cells, and they're continuous with the great vessels entering and leaving the heart. In the image on the bottom right, you can see the orientation of the cardiac muscle fibers, and this gives the heart its strength and power to pump blood around the body or to the lungs. So staying with the pericardium, I've already mentioned that the very outer part of the pericardium is called the fibrous pericardium. It's made of very dense, irregular connective tissue that helps to anchor the heart in position and helps to protect it, and also helps to prevent overstretching of the heart. Whereas the serous pericardium is a very delicate membrane. It contains a parietal layer out, which adheres to the fibrous pericardium, and then a visceral layer that adheres to the heart itself. The space between contains serous fluid or pericardial fluid. This fluid enables the heart to beat in a frictionless environment. The pericardial cavity is a potential space filled with that serous fluid that I mentioned, and it's made up of an outer parietal and an inner visceral layer. Sometimes this can become inflamed, a condition known as pericarditis. It's often associated with bleeding into the pericardial cavity. This can potentially compress the heart and make it very difficult for the heart to beat, and it can be potentially fatal. So the three layers of the heart are the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. The epicardium consists of mesothelial tissue and connective tissue, which is the pericardium. The myocardium is composed of cardiac muscle cells, and they're only found in the heart. You won't find cardiac muscle anywhere else in the body. And the endocardium consists of endothelial cells, which are very smooth, flat cells that are continuous with the vessels, the blood vessels, and they sit on a tiny little basement membrane made of connective tissue. If the myocardium becomes inflamed, it's a condition known as myocarditis, and this is a very dangerous condition. And endocarditis is inflammation of the lining membrane, the endocardium. So looking at the image again, the epicardium is the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. The myocardium is the muscle layer, and the endocardium is the lining membrane that lines the heart. It covers the valves and is continuous with the great vessels. Muscle of the myocardium is made up of superficial and deep muscle fibres. They're extremely dense around the chambers, tapering off toward the great vessels. The arrangement of the muscle promotes efficient expulsion of the maximum amount of blood per heart contraction. Inside the heart there are 4 chambers. There are 2 upper receiving chambers called the atria, one on the left, one on the right, and there are 2 lower pumping chambers called the ventricles, again, one on the left and one on the right. This image gives you a clear picture of the different chambers. The 2 smaller chambers are the atrium. They receive blood from the body. The left atrium receives blood from the lungs that has just picked up oxygen and is returning back to the heart. The right atrium is receiving deoxygenated blood from the body, from the rest of the body. From these 2 chambers, the blood flows into the ventricles. The right ventricle pumps the blood into the pulmonary trunk and then off to the lungs to get rid of the CO2 and to pick up oxygen. The left ventricle, when that pumps blood to the whole body system, so up to the head and down to the toes, all over. The chambers are compartmentalized through valves. Between the atrias and the ventricles are the atrioventricular valves. Between the left atria and left ventricle, this valve is called the bicuspid or mitral valve. Between the right atria and the right ventricle, this valve is called the tricuspid valve. Now they're so named, bicuspid and tricuspid, because the bicuspid has two tissue leaflets, whereas the tricuspid has three. The valves between the left and right ventricles and the great vessels are called the semilunar valves. So the semilunar valve between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk is called the pulmonary valve. The semilunar valve between the left ventricle and the aorta is called the aortic valve. The functioning of these valves is to stop backflow of blood. For instance, when blood falls from the atrias into the ventricles, it falls through open valves. When the ventricles contract to force that blood up into either the pulmonary trunk or the aorta, we don't want blood being pushed back into the atrias, so those valves will close, preventing blood from flowing back into the atria, and will maximise the amount of blood then available to be pushed through the open semilunar valves into the pulmonary trunk or the aorta. The semilunar valves act to prevent blood falling back into the ventricles once the ventricles have contracted. So on the left side of the heart, when the left ventricle contracts, the blood is directed up through an open semilunar valve into the aorta. When the left ventricle relaxes, we don't want that blood falling back into the left ventricle, so it's captured by the three leaflets of the aortic valve that shuts the valve and prevents backflow back into the left ventricle. The same thing is happening in the right ventricle and the right semilunar valve, but in this case, the blood being pumped from the right ventricle up through the open pulmonic semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk is on its way to the lungs. Now, much of what I've mentioned as we've been looking at that diagram is written in the next few slides, so we'll just skim over it again as a bit of a revision. The atrias are the receiving chambers. The right atria receives blood from three vessels. The superior vena cava drains blood from the head, the neck, and the upper limbs. The inferior vena cava drains blood from the lower part of the body and the trunk. The coronary sinus drains blood from the heart muscle or the heart tissue. There is a septum or a division between the two atrias. There hasn't always been a closed circuit. During fetal development and embryonic development, there is a hole that runs between the left side and the right side of the heart, but this must close very shortly after birth. This is called the fossa ovalis. The fossa ovalis is a remnant of this tiny little hole called the fetal foramen ovale. The tricuspid valve is the valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle, and it prevents blood from being pushed back into the right atrium when the right ventricle contracts. So when the right ventricle contracts, it sends blood up the pulmonary trunk and into the lungs to get rid of the carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen. These little valves, the atrioventricular valve or the tricuspid valve on this side, are attached to tiny little muscles called the papillary muscles by structures called the chordae tendineae. The chordae tendineae are made of very, very tough connective tissue. So when the right ventricle contracts, the papillary muscles also contract. They pull on the chordae tendineae and they stop the tricuspid valve leaflets from inverting into the right ventricle under the pressure of blood moving from the ventricle up into the great vessel. The left atrium receives blood from 4 pulmonary veins, 2 from the right lung and 2 from the left lung. These are bringing oxygenated blood back to the heart so that it can be pumped out into general circulation to go to all of the tissues. Once the atrium has received that blood, most of it will fall into the left ventricle quite passively. It will squeeze the last bit down. When the ventricle contracts, the bicuspid valve closes in much the same way as the tricuspid valve does on the right side of the heart. The left ventricle is a ventricle that pumps blood all around the body. So it has a much thicker cardiac muscle. In fact, the cardiac muscle in the left ventricle can be anywhere between 10 and 15 millimeters thick. During fetal life, a small vessel shunts blood back and forth from the pulmonary trunk to the aorta. This is called the ductus arteriosus. And it closes shortly after birth, leaving a small tissue remnant known as the ligamentum arteriosum. Now, the term sulci is probably familiar to you. A sulci is a groove, and we do have a lot of sulci in the brain tissue. So, sulci on the surface of the heart are grooves that run on the surface of the heart, and these house the coronary blood vessels and a little bit of fat to support those vessels and cushion them. The coronary sulcus encircles the heart and makes the boundary between the atria and the ventricles. The anterior interventricular sulcus marks the boundary between the ventricles anteriorly, and the posterior interventricular sulcus marks the boundary between the ventricles posteriorly. This image shows the various sulci around the chambers, and the arrows indicate where those sulci lie. So have a little bit of a look at these diagrams when you get a minute. The one on the left is an anterior view, and the one on the right is a posterior view. Now, I did mention that the myocardium, or the cardiac muscle, is much thicker on the left side, or the left ventricle, than it is in the right ventricle. So the thickness of the myocardium of the 4 chambers does vary according to the function of each of those chambers. The atrial walls are quite thin because most of the blood that they receive is going to fall quite passively into the ventricles. They will contract, but they'll really only be delivering about 20% of their remaining blood down into the ventricles under atrial contraction. Whereas the ventricles are the major pumping chambers. The right ventricle only has to pump to the lungs, so the myocardium is much thinner on the right side, whereas the left ventricle has to pump to the rest of the body. So the left ventricular myocardium is very, very thick. As I've mentioned, around about 10 to 15 millimetres thick. If we have a look at these diagrams, we can see the difference in thickness of the myocardium. The diagram on the left shows quite a thin myocardial wall on the right side of the heart, which is the left side of the image, and a very thick myocardial wall on the left side of the heart, which is on the right side of the image. If we look at the diagram on the right, this is a transverse section cut through the ventricles. Again, you can see the right ventricle has a very thin myocardial layer, whereas the left ventricle has a much thicker myocardial layer. Okay, that brings us to the end of part 1 of our study of the heart. Have a bit of a break, get up and stretch your legs, move about a bit, have something to eat, have something to drink, just generally have a little bit of a rest and come back refreshed for the second part of this study of the heart, where we'll be looking at heart valves and how the blood circulates